It was a crisp autumn morning when Marlon stepped into the sleek, glass-walled showroom of the upscale car dealership. The building gleamed with modern elegance, the kind of place where rich, successful people shopped for cars that screamed wealth and sophistication. From the polished marble floors to the glistening chrome accents, everything screamed luxury, and Marlon knew that this was a world he wasn't often part of. At 6 feet tall with a broad frame, Marlon was the picture of strength and confidence, but the moment he walked through the door, the energy of the showroom shifted. His worn hoodie, ripped jeans, and the sneakers that had carried him through years of struggling to make his mark in the world, were a stark contrast to the impeccably tailored suits and polished shoes of the clientele who regularly walked through those doors. Yet, he was a man of vision, a man whose soul was driven by passion and creativity. His heart was full of ambition, a deep desire to experience the finer things in life, to step beyond the limits that society had placed upon him. Today, he was determined to make that leap. As he walked further into the dealership, a few heads turned, but not in admiration. No, these looks were more skeptical, curious glances that seemed to weigh him, judge him before he had even spoken a word. The rich, luxurious world inside the dealership felt cold to him, almost uninviting, but Marlon wasn't easily discouraged. He had earned every ounce of his confidence through the sweat of his brow and the brush strokes of his art, but it was clear that this world didn't see him as someone who belonged. The salespeople, dressed in sharp suits, stood in clusters near the cars, exchanging polite conversation as they eyed Marlon from across the showroom. They had seen countless customers walk in over the years, some casual, some serious buyers, and then there was Marlon. He was different. Not in a way that they could pinpoint, but in a way that made them uneasy. His skin, his attire, his demeanor, they were all markers of a story they couldn't place, and so their instincts kicked in. Without even a word, their eyes scanned him with the cold calculation of someone assessing whether or not he was worthy of their time. It wasn't long before a young salesman, whose name tag read James, approached him with a polite, almost rehearsed smile. "Can I help you, sir?" James asked, his tone smooth but distant. There was no warmth, no enthusiasm in his voice. Marlon met the man's gaze without hesitation, his own eyes sharp and steady. "I'm interested in looking at your high-end models. The ones with the performance packages," he said, his voice deep and confident. James's smile faltered, just for a second, as he glanced at Marlon's appearance. It was as though a brief flash of judgment crossed his face, an unspoken assumption that Marlon, with his hoodie and worn shoes, couldn't possibly afford the luxury car he was inquiring about. But the smile quickly returned, more polished, as James nodded towards the most expensive models on the showroom floor. "Right this way," he said, gesturing toward the line of sleek, gleaming sports cars. They were the kind of cars that made people stop and stare, a bright red Ferrari, a sleek black Lamborghini, and a silver Porsche that sparkled under the showroom lights. But even as James led Marlon to the cars, his movements were stiff, almost hesitant, as if he was waiting for Marlon to say something to reveal that he was just here for the experience, not a serious buyer. James went on, explaining the specs and features of each vehicle, but Marlon barely listened. He wasn't here for a sales pitch. He knew the cars, knew their value, and knew what they represented. He wasn't intimidated by the price tags, he had dreams, and dreams were priceless. What bothered him, though, was the invisible barrier that had been put up the moment he walked in. The judgment, the assumption that he was less than, that he wasn't good enough to even touch the cars. As James continued to prattle on, his tone increasingly condescending, Marlon's patience wore thin. He knew what was happening. The subtle shifts in James's posture, the way his eyes flicked nervously towards the other customers, the way he constantly checked the time as if waiting for this exchange to be over, Marlon realized that James didn't truly see him, didn't understand him, and more importantly, didn't believe he could afford the car he was interested in. Marlon took a step forward, examining the Porsche, his fingers gently tracing the curves of the car. He loved the feel of it, the way it was both aggressive and graceful. He could see the potential it had, not just as a status symbol, but as a representation of his own journey. The hours of hard work, the late nights painting in his cramped studio, The rejection he had faced over the years, the battles he had fought for every inch of recognition in a world that had refused to acknowledge his talent. He had come a long way, and the car, to him, was a symbol of everything he had worked for. "I'm serious about this car," Marlon finally said, his voice cutting through the silence. James looked at him, disbelief flickering in his eyes. He hesitated for a moment before replying, his words carefully measured, as if trying to downplay the situation. "Of course," James said, offering a tight smile. "But I'm afraid these models, they're for a certain clientele. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable with something more affordable." It was a subtle insult, but it was there, plain as day. Marlon could feel the sting of it deep within, but he refused to let it show. He had faced far worse than this, far more overt racism, far more blatant assumptions. But there was something about the way James had said it, as if his worth could be measured by his appearance, that cut deeper than anything else. Marlon took a deep breath, his fingers gripping the sleek metal of the Porsche. He had worked for this moment, had earned the right to walk into this dealership, to sit in these cars, and to buy one if he chose to. No one could take that away from him. "I'm not interested in something affordable," Marlon said, his voice steady. "I'm here for the car I want." James's face stiffened, and Marlon could see the wheels turning in his mind. Perhaps he was calculating how best to dismiss this out-of-place customer without causing too much of a scene. But Marlon wasn't backing down. Not this time. At that moment, another customer entered the showroom, a well-dressed man who looked exactly like the kind of person James was used to dealing with. The contrast was obvious, and James quickly shifted his attention, all but abandoning Marlon in the process. The dismissal was clear. The message was clear. Marlon didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He turned and walked towards the door, the cool breeze outside feeling more welcoming than the cold reception he had just received. As he left the dealership, he held his head high, the sting of rejection slowly fading into a quiet resolve. The world would not define him. He was not just a black man in a hoodie, he was an artist, a creator, and one day, he would walk into a dealership like this and buy whatever car he wanted, no questions asked. That day, he knew, was coming. And it would be a day of triumph, a victory over the assumptions and biases that still lingered in the world. For now, though, he would continue to paint, to create, to build his legacy. The rejection was just another stepping stone on the path to greatness. Marlon stood outside the gallery, staring at its gleaming windows, his heart racing. This wasn't just any gallery, this was the heart of modern art, one of the most prestigious spaces in the city. It was the kind of place where only the most talented or well-connected artists found their work displayed. He had been dreaming of this moment for years, of walking through those doors, proudly presenting his collection, and seeing his art hung on those pristine white walls, illuminated under the soft, carefully positioned lights. He had spent months preparing for this day, pouring his soul into each piece, capturing the nuances of life and emotion that had shaped his own existence. Every stroke of the brush was a piece of himself, his pain, his joy, his struggles, and his triumphs. His work was a reflection of his journey, a journey from the streets to the studio, from being dismissed and overlooked to creating something that had the power to make people stop and think. He knew his art was special, but today, he hoped to make others see it too. But as Marlon approached the gallery's entrance, something in the pit of his stomach twisted. There was a sense of unease, a feeling of being out of place, but he tried to shake it off. His confidence had carried him this far, and it would carry him through the next step. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The gallery was everything he had imagined, elegant, modern, and full of the kind of art that made you think, made you feel, made you see the world in a different light. The walls were adorned with vibrant, abstract paintings, minimalist sculptures, and photographs that captured the raw, fleeting moments of life. But as he glanced around, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that something about this place felt different. It wasn't just the white walls and polished floors. No, it was the people. The people who had come to view the art. The visitors milling around the space were clad in the uniform of the rich and influential, The ones who could afford to buy art like this, to spend thousands on something that would sit in a private collection. They exchanged sharp, clipped words with the kind of confidence that comes only from years of privilege. It was the world Marlon had always dreamed of stepping into, but as he walked further into the gallery, he felt the weight of their stares, the subtle, almost imperceptible judgment that followed him with every step. He tried not to focus on it. He wasn't here to impress them. He was here to present his art to someone who mattered, someone who could see the potential, the vision behind it. After a few minutes of nervously wandering through the gallery, he spotted him, the gallery owner. A tall, middle-aged man with an impeccable suit, immaculately combed hair, and an air of arrogance that was almost palpable. His name, Marlon had learned from his research, was Vincent Prescott. A man known for his refined taste and discerning eye, someone who had the power to make or break an artist's career with a single glance. Marlon took a deep breath and approached him, the weight of the moment heavy on his chest. He held a small portfolio under his arm, containing a selection of his work. The gallery owner was standing by a massive canvas, discussing the piece with a group of admirers, but he paused when Marlon walked up to him. "Excuse me, Mr. Prescott," Marlon said, trying to steady his voice. "My name is Marlon. I'm an artist, and I would love to show you my work." Vincent Prescott turned his attention toward him, his cold, calculating eyes scanning Marlon from head to toe. There was a brief moment of silence as Prescott's gaze lingered on the portfolio Marlon was holding, then flicked back up to Marlon's face. It was a look that made Marlon feel like an object to be evaluated, not a person. Prescott murmured, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "Another artist looking for validation, huh? Let's see what you've got." Marlon's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the way Prescott had spoken that made his work feel trivial, as though it were something beneath him, something to be indulged for a moment before being dismissed. But Marlon pushed past the unease and opened the portfolio, carefully pulling out his first painting, a large, expressive piece that captured the chaotic energy of city life. Bright, bold strokes of color, interwoven with dark, shadowy corners that represented the struggles of those who lived on the margins. He placed the painting in front of Prescott, watching the man's expression change as he looked it over. For a brief moment, Marlon felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Prescott would see the beauty in it, the raw emotion, the vulnerability. Maybe he would understand what the piece was trying to convey. Prescott's smile widened, but it wasn't one of appreciation. It was the kind of smile that said he had already made up his mind, that he was already planning how to dismiss this entire exchange. "Well," Prescott began, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is interesting, I suppose. But it's not really what we're looking for here, is it?" He let out a small laugh, turning the painting slightly, as if inspecting it like a cheap trinket. "It's so raw, so rough, almost as if it hasn't been fully realized yet. It lacks sophistication, don't you think?" Marlon's stomach twisted, but he tried to keep his composure. He had been here before, he had faced rejection, faced mockery, but not from someone like this. Prescott wasn't just dismissing his work, he was mocking it. Mocking him. He took a breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I understand your point, but..." But Prescott wasn't done. With a flick of his wrist, he waved the painting aside, as though it were nothing more than a minor distraction. "You see, we have a certain standard here at the heart of modern art. Our clientele expects works that are not just expressive," he said, pausing as if the word itself was too crude to say aloud, "but refined, polished, intelligent. You know, worthy of their attention. This," he pointed at Marlon's painting, "isn't it?" Marlon felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I understand that my style may not be what you're used to," he said, trying to find his voice, "but it's my truth. My expression. And I know there's an audience for it." Prescott let out a condescending chuckle. "Oh, I'm sure there's someone out there who might appreciate it, perhaps a small group of niche collectors, maybe. But in this gallery?" He looked around, as though the very space itself demanded a certain level of importance. "This? It's not the right fit." The sting of rejection burned deep, but it wasn't just the words that hurt. It was the way Prescott spoke to him, as if Marlon were beneath him, as if his art, his soul, were insignificant. Without a word, Marlon began to pack up his portfolio, his hands trembling slightly. He could feel the eyes of the gallery visitors on him now, the whispers behind his back. Some stared openly, while others pretended to ignore the scene unfolding before them. But it didn't matter. Marlon had heard it all before. "Perhaps I was wrong to think you could see the value in my work," he said softly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside of him. "But I believe in it. And I believe in myself." With that, he turned and walked out of the gallery, leaving behind the polished, arrogant world of Vincent Prescott. The mockery had stung, but Marlon knew one thing for sure: he would keep creating. He would find a place for his art, a space where it could thrive. Because no gallery, no matter how prestigious, could define his worth. That was something only he could do. Marlon stepped out of the heart of modern art, with the sting of rejection still sharp against his skin. As he walked down the street, he didn't look back, not even once. His pace was steady, but his mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. He had expected to encounter skepticism, perhaps even rejection. But nothing could have prepared him for the cold mockery that had come from Vincent Prescott, the very man he had hoped would recognize the worth of his art. The street outside the gallery was busy with people going about their lives, but to Marlon, everything felt distant. The city's hustle and bustle, the noise, the chatter, it was all muffled in his ears. His hands clenched into fists by his sides, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger. Disappointment. Resignation. But most of all, there was a quiet, growing sense of something deeper, understanding. He knew, deep down, that Prescott's rejection wasn't a reflection of his art. It wasn't a reflection of him. It was a reflection of the limitations of the world around him, limitations based on appearances, assumptions, and biases. But Marlon had long since learned that the world didn't get to decide his worth. It was up to him, and today, he had just been reminded of why his journey was so important. As he walked, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. There was a message from his assistant, Emily. "Hey, Marlon. Just a quick reminder, the Collector's Gala tonight at the museum. The invitation is confirmed. See you there, right?" Marlon paused for a moment, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had almost forgotten. Tonight, he would be at a gala hosted by one of the most renowned art museums in the world, showcasing some of his finest works. The same works that Prescott had just dismissed, with barely a glance. Marlon stepped out of the heart of modern art, with the sting of rejection still sharp against his skin. As he walked down the street, he didn't look back, not even once. His pace was steady, but his mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. He had expected to encounter skepticism, perhaps even rejection. But nothing could have prepared him for the cold mockery that had come from Vincent Prescott, the very man he had hoped would recognize the worth of his art. The street outside the gallery was busy with people going about their lives, but to Marlon, everything felt distant. The city's hustle and bustle, the noise, the chatter, it was all muffled in his ears. His hands clenched into fists by his sides, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger. Disappointment. Resignation. But most of all, there was a quiet, growing sense of something deeper, understanding. He knew, deep down, that Prescott's rejection wasn't a reflection of his art. It wasn't a reflection of him. It was a reflection of the limitations of the world around him, limitations based on appearances, assumptions, and biases. But Marlon had long since learned that the world didn't get to decide his worth. It was up to him, and today, he had just been reminded of why his journey was so important. As he walked, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. There was a message from his assistant, Emily. "Hey, Marlon. Just a quick reminder, the Collector's Gala tonight at the museum. The invitation is confirmed. See you there, right?" Marlon paused for a moment, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had almost forgotten. Tonight, he would be at a gala hosted by one of the most renowned art museums in the world, showcasing some of his finest works. The same works that Prescott had just dismissed with barely a glance. With a deep breath, Marlon typed back a quick reply, "I'll be there." "Thanks, Emily." The message sent, but the words didn't feel enough to shake the heaviness in his chest. There was still that lingering sense of injustice, the feeling that the world couldn't truly see him for what he was. But as he made his way toward the museum, something stirred inside him. Perhaps tonight was the night that would change everything. Maybe it wasn't about the galleries or the snobbish critics who only saw value in the world of high society. Maybe his art was destined for something more. The gala that evening was a lavish affair, held at one of the city's most prestigious museums, a place where the finest art from around the world was displayed. The grand hall was filled with the sound of classical music, and the glittering chandeliers above cast a soft, elegant glow over the entire space. The guests, dressed in exquisite gowns and tailored suits, mingled with one another, their conversations a blur of sophistication. But among them, Marlon stood out, not because of his attire, but because of the quiet confidence he exuded. Tonight, his presence was more than just a formality. It was a statement. He walked through the museum, past the crowd of elite art collectors and renowned critics, and toward the area where his works were being displayed. The curator, a woman named Sarah, had already arranged his pieces to stand out in their own section, a mix of bold abstract portraits and intricate, layered landscapes that told stories of struggle, hope, and human connection. As Marlon approached, he noticed a small group of people gathered in front of his latest painting, an explosive piece that depicted a vibrant burst of color swirling around a solitary figure, symbolizing the isolation and chaos of the modern world. The expressions on their faces were exactly what he had hoped for, mesmerized, moved, lost in the emotion of the painting. Marlon took a moment to stand back and watch, his heart swelling with pride. This was what he had worked for. This was the reason he kept going. To see people feel his work, to have it spark something deep inside them, this was worth far more than any gallery owner's approval. As the group of admirers continued to discuss the piece, one of the individuals, a distinguished-looking man in his late 50s, stepped forward. "This is absolutely magnificent," the man said, his voice filled with genuine awe. The intensity, the rawness, the way it captures such a personal, human experience. "It's extraordinary." Marlon's gaze turned to the man, recognizing him instantly. It was Thomas Vickery, one of the most influential art collectors in the world, known for his discerning taste and his extensive collection of rare and valuable pieces. Vickery had bought works from the likes of Picasso, Rothko, and Basquiat. He was the kind of collector that every artist dreamed of reaching, the kind of person who could elevate an artist's career to heights they'd only ever imagined. Vickery turned to Marlon, noticing him standing nearby, and smiled. "I don't believe we've met." Thomas Vickery. He extended a hand, his smile warm yet professional. Marlon shook his hand, fighting the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "Marlon," he said simply, trying to maintain his composure. Vickery's eyes widened for a moment, then narrowed with interest. "Ah, Marlon," he said, almost as if he were testing the name, as if he recognized it from somewhere. "Are you the Marlon, the artist from the contemporary scene? The one whose pieces have been causing quite the stir?" Marlon nodded, his heart skipping a beat. "Yes, that's me." Vickery's smile grew even broader, now mixed with a look of genuine respect. "I thought so. Your work is, well, it's nothing short of breathtaking. I've heard your pieces are already sought after by some of the top museums and collectors in Europe. Quite an impressive feat for someone of your, how do I put it, unique style." Marlon felt a surge of pride, but he kept his response modest. "Thank you, Mr. Vickery. It's been a journey, but I'm honored by the attention my work has received." Vickery nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "You know," he said, lowering his voice, "I've been following your career for a while now. I recently saw your latest exhibit at the Tate in London, and I was absolutely blown away. Your pieces, there's something deeply moving about them. They're more than just paintings. They speak. I would be honored to add some of your work to my personal collection. In fact, I'm already making plans to acquire several pieces from this show. Marlon's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the validation he had been searching for, the recognition that came not from empty words, but from the actions of those who truly understood the value of his art. The realization hit him like a wave. The world of galleries and critics like Prescott, who had dismissed him earlier, was just a small part of the larger landscape. His work was already making waves in the right circles, among people who truly saw and appreciated its worth. As Vickery continued to speak, Marlon's mind drifted back to the gallery owner who had laughed at his art. Prescott had no idea who he had rejected. If only he knew that Marlon's work was already being sold at auction houses for millions, already hanging in the most prestigious museums around the world, already being admired by the elite of the art world. If only he knew that Marlon's name was already cemented in the history of contemporary art. But it didn't matter. Marlon didn't need Prescott's approval. He didn't need anyone's approval. His work spoke for itself. And tonight, the people who mattered, the ones who truly understood art, were the ones who had come to see him, to celebrate his vision. They were the ones who knew what real value looked like. And in that moment, Marlon knew that he had already achieved what he had set out to do. He had already arrived. The weeks following Marlon's encounter at the heart of modern art felt like an odd mix of dreams and reality. At first, he had been unsure whether his art would continue to be seen as valuable or whether the sting of that gallery owner's rejection would linger. But what he didn't know at the time was that the rejection he had faced was not a setback. It was, in a strange way, a moment of quiet transformation. While the art world's more exclusive galleries had failed to recognize his genius, something else was unfolding, something far beyond the boundaries of those polished walls. His work was beginning to gain momentum in unexpected ways. It wasn't the immediate attention from critics or major collectors that marked the start of his rise, it was the quieter, subtler waves that began to ripple across the art world. It all began with an invitation. Marlon had been working in his studio, as he always did, tirelessly creating new pieces and refining his craft, when he received an email from an international curator named Claudia Moretti. She was organizing an exhibition at one of Europe's most prestigious contemporary art museums, the International Gallery of Modern Expression, located in Paris. The exhibit was to feature a curated selection of the most innovative and influential contemporary artists of the year, and Claudia had chosen Marlon to be part of it. At first, Marlon thought it was a mistake. He had never been to Paris, never exhibited in such an esteemed space. But after a brief email exchange and the unmistakable confidence that Claudia exuded in her words, it became clear, this was real. His work was being recognized, and it wasn't just by any museum, it was one of the finest in the world. His first major international exhibition was a quiet affair. There was no massive press conference, no red carpet moment. But the moment the doors to the museum opened, everything changed. Marlon's paintings, vibrant, raw, and expressive, captured the attention of the art world in a way that he had only dreamed about. The night of the opening, a group of critics from various art publications stood before his largest piece, a colossal canvas that dominated the room. It was a piece about identity, race, and the human experience, an exploration of how the individual is both shaped by and struggles against societal forces. The critics whispered among themselves, their eyes darting from one detail to the next. As they examined his work, a sense of awe spread across the room, palpable and undeniable. In the days that followed, the reviews began to pour in. Art enthusiasts, collectors, and critics from all corners of the globe were captivated by the raw intensity and emotional depth of his paintings. The New York Times wrote, "Marlon's work challenges our perceptions of what it means to be seen. His use of color, texture, and movement makes his art not just something to look at, but something to feel." Meanwhile, Art Review magazine dubbed him the Artist of the Year, noting how his unapologetically bold work was not only a commentary on the human condition, but also an invitation to explore the complexities of existence itself. They went on to call his pieces masterpieces of modern expressionism. Marland's name quickly became synonymous with the new wave of art, one that combined emotional truth with striking visual impact. And just as quickly, his market value skyrocketed. It was like a ripple effect. After his exhibition in Paris, he was invited to show his work at the Tate Modern in London, where his pieces were displayed alongside renowned artists like Gerhard Richter and Banksy. His paintings were now not just part of exhibitions, they were becoming a part of the conversation. People weren't just talking about his work, they were feeling it. It resonated deeply with them, and that connection was undeniable. Within weeks, his paintings began fetching prices that would make even the most seasoned art collector take notice. An auction at Sotheby's, which included several of Marland's works, saw his pieces soar to unprecedented prices. One of his paintings, a haunting portrayal of a solitary figure surrounded by waves of chaotic color, sold for a staggering $4.2 million. The bidding was fast and furious, with collectors from all over the world jostling to claim his work as their own. But the money wasn't what Marland focused on. The true reward for him was the recognition. The validation that had eluded him for so long was now flooding in from every direction. His work was no longer just admired, it was revered. It was seen as a symbol of artistic achievement, a manifestation of everything he had worked for and fought to create. By the time his pieces were featured in the Venice Biennale, the world had taken notice. Marland was no longer just an emerging artist. He was a force in the art world. Curators and critics were now vying for the opportunity to exhibit his work. Art collectors, some of the most powerful figures in the industry, began to amass collections of his paintings, willing to pay whatever it took to own a piece of his history. But even as his reputation grew, Marland remained grounded. He hadn't forgotten the nights he spent in his cramped studio, painting with the bare minimum, scraping by to make ends meet. He hadn't forgotten the rejection he faced from those who had judged him based on his appearance rather than his art. He hadn't forgotten the gallery owner who had laughed at his work, dismissing him as just another hopeful artist. He had come a long way, but he knew that he was just getting started. Despite his newfound success, Marland was not the type to rest on his laurels. He continued to create, continued to evolve. His studio, once a small, dimly lit room filled with half-finished canvases, had now transformed into a vast, airy space filled with natural light, and his work reflected the change. His art grew bolder, more daring. He began experimenting with new mediums, incorporating elements of sculpture and installation into his pieces. He wanted to push the boundaries even further, to continue challenging the perceptions of what art could be and how it could speak to people. One of his most groundbreaking projects took place in New York, where he unveiled a series of large-scale installations that bridged the gap between visual art and immersive experiences. The installations were designed to take viewers on a journey through abstract representations of identity, race, and memory, issues that had been at the core of his work since the beginning. The installations were so impactful that they caused a sensation, attracting thousands of visitors and generating discussions that spread beyond the art world. The media coverage was relentless. Documentaries began to be made about Marland's rise in the art world. Interviews with him appeared in the most prestigious magazines, and his work was the subject of in-depth analysis in both academic and popular circles. Marland had become a cultural figure, someone whose art was no longer just something you viewed, but something you experienced. Collectors and museums weren't the only ones taking notice. Major corporations reached out, wanting to commission him for private collections or collaborations that would elevate their brands. He was invited to be a keynote speaker at global art forums, his insights and experiences sought after by aspiring artists and critics alike. But through it all, Marland remained committed to his truth. His success, though undeniable, never clouded the core of who he was as an artist. He continued to focus on the depth and emotion of his work, never losing sight of the raw, unfiltered essence that had first driven him to create. In the quiet moments, when the lights of fame and fortune seemed far away, Marland would return to his studio, the one place where he was still just an artist, lost in his craft. There, amidst the colors and brushes, he found his peace, And in those moments, he knew that he had built something far more valuable than fame or wealth. He had created a legacy, a body of work that would live on long after the prices of his paintings had been forgotten. He had created art that would never be confined by the walls of galleries or the narrow-minded judgments of those who couldn't see its worth. Marlon had built something that transcended the art world's fickle trends, something that would continue to speak to the hearts and minds of those who truly understood. The world might have taken a while to catch up, but Marlon's success was proof that true art, the kind that reflects the soul, cannot be ignored forever. And in the end, it was this truth that would define him, not the money, not the recognition, but the deep, lasting connection his art created with the world. Months had passed since Marlon had walked out of the heart of modern art, the gallery where he had once been humiliated. The sting of rejection, though dulled over time, still lingered in his memory. It wasn't the dismissal of his art that had hurt the most, but the way the gallery owner, Vincent Prescott, had looked at him with disdain, his judgment so casual, so final. To Prescott, Marlon had been just another hopeful artist, too rough, too raw, not refined enough for the world he represented. It wasn't even a matter of his art not being good enough. It was about his appearance, his background. To Prescott, he was a non-entity. But as the months went by, something inside Marlon changed. He began to see that the rejection hadn't been a failure. It had been a turning point. It had forced him to look beyond the narrow definitions of success that so many in the art world clung to. It had pushed him to find his own path, his own voice, and it had led him to places he had never dreamed possible. His art had taken on a life of its own, gaining recognition worldwide. His exhibitions were now regularly featured in the most prestigious galleries and museums. His work was being sold for millions of dollars. His name had become synonymous with modern expressionism, and his influence was spreading across the art world like wildfire. Yet, despite all of this success, Marlon hadn't forgotten Vincent Prescott. He hadn't forgotten the man who had so casually dismissed him, the man who had mocked him and his work. There was a fire that burned inside him, a quiet resolve to confront the man who had so blatantly humiliated him. He had come so far, but there was still unfinished business. This was not about proving himself to Prescott, it was about showing him the consequences of his arrogance, of his ignorance. It was about reminding the art world that true art could not be dismissed or ignored, no matter who created it. One cold winter afternoon, several months after his meteoric rise, Marlon found himself standing outside the very gallery that had once rejected him. The heart of modern art gleamed as it always did, its glass windows reflecting the hustle of the street outside, the polished interior filled with the soft hum of luxury. But this time it felt different. Marlon stood tall, his silhouette a striking figure of confidence against the backdrop of the gallery's pristine exterior. He was no longer the nervous, unpolished artist who had walked through those doors before. The man who now stood in front of the gallery was someone entirely different, someone whose presence commanded attention. He pushed open the door with a sense of purpose, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors as he entered. The sound of his entrance caught the attention of a few of the salespeople who were milling around the space, but it was Vincent Prescott who took notice the moment Marlon walked in. Prescott was standing near the front of the gallery, talking to a potential client, when he looked up and saw him. At first, there was no recognition in his eyes. He saw just another visitor, a well-dressed man with an air of quiet authority, someone who seemed like they belonged in the world of fine art. Prescott continued his conversation, but Marlon's steady gaze didn't waver. He had the full attention of the room, even if the gallery owner didn't realize it yet. It wasn't until Marlon began walking closer to Prescott, his steps confident and unhurried, that the gallery owner's smile faltered. A flicker of uncertainty passed across his face as Marlon approached, but Prescott's instincts kicked in. He straightened himself, smoothing his suit as though preparing for an important conversation. He extended his hand with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to making deals. "Good afternoon," Prescott said, his voice cool and smooth, his eyes scanning Marlon's face. "Can I help you with something today?" Marlon took the man's hand, but instead of responding immediately, he just smiled, calmly, deliberately. Prescott's grip tightened for a moment, his fingers brushing against Marlon's with an almost imperceptible sense of discomfort. It wasn't the handshake of a man who had expected to meet an artist, especially not one who might have been in his position months ago. "I'm not here to buy," Marlon finally said, his voice low but firm. "I'm here to speak with you." Prescott raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled but trying to maintain his composure. He glanced at the staff members who were watching from a distance, as though trying to gauge how to handle the situation. There was an awkward pause before he spoke again, his tone slightly guarded. "Well, I'm always happy to discuss art, of course. Please, let me know how I can assist you." Marlon didn't immediately respond, instead taking a slow, deliberate walk through the gallery, letting the silence hang between them. Prescott, still unsure of how to handle the situation, followed him at a distance, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to place this visitor, this man who seemed so familiar, yet so out of place. Finally, Marlon turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "I'm sure you don't remember me, Mr. Prescott," he said, the words spoken with an unsettling calm. "But I remember you. I remember exactly what you said when I was here last time." Prescott's face shifted slightly, the faintest hint of recognition sparking in his eyes, but it was quickly concealed behind a well-practiced mask. He blinked, his posture stiffening, though he tried to mask the discomfort creeping in. "I'm afraid I'm not sure I know what you mean," Prescott replied, his voice smooth, but the slight hesitation in his words was telling. Marlon didn't flinch. "You wouldn't remember me. You probably see hundreds of faces like mine every day, artists hoping for a break, hoping for validation. But you looked at me and saw someone who wasn't worth your time. You dismissed my art before even looking at it. You mocked it. You laughed at it." There was no anger in Marlon's voice, just a quiet assertion of truth. And for a brief moment, Prescott's face twitched, the illusion of control slipping as the past came rushing back to him. His mouth opened, but the words didn't come. He knew what Marlon was talking about. It was all flooding back, the dismissive attitude, the laughter, the clear judgment that had lingered in his voice when he had rejected Marlon's work. Marlon stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Prescott's. "You didn't think I had what it took, did you? You didn't think my work was refined enough for this gallery. But I've learned a few things since then." He let the words sink in, his gaze unwavering. "I've learned that art isn't about whether you're wearing a suit or driving the right car. It's about the truth in your work. It's about the heart, the soul, the raw expression. And the truth is, my work is everywhere now. It's being shown in the world's finest galleries. It's being sold for millions." Prescott, still struggling to maintain his composure, now looked visibly uncomfortable. He opened his mouth, but Marlon held up a hand, silencing him. "You don't need to say anything, Mr. Prescott," Marlon said softly, his voice now laced with a quiet sense of triumph. "I just wanted you to know that the person you humiliated, he's not someone you get to dismiss anymore. The next time you look at a painting, I hope you remember me. And I hope you remember that true art can't be judged by your narrow standards." With that, Marlon turned and began to walk out of the gallery, his footsteps echoing in the stillness behind him. Prescott stood frozen in place, his eyes fixed on the retreating figure of the man who had just turned his world upside down. The shock on his face was unmistakable, but it was too late. Marlon had already moved beyond his reach. As Marlon stepped out into the street, the cold air feeling invigorating against his skin, he felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. This wasn't just about confrontation. It was about redemption. It was about proving to himself that nothing, not rejection, not mockery, could ever take away what was rightfully his worth, his art, and his place in the world. And as he walked away from the heart of modern art, Marlon knew that he had already won. The air in the heart of modern art felt thicker than usual. Vincent Prescott stood frozen, his eyes still locked on the door through which Marlon had just exited. The artist, the man he had so casually dismissed months earlier, had walked out of the gallery with a quiet, unyielding confidence. Marlon hadn't raised his voice, hadn't argued or tried to impress. He simply spoke the truth, in a calm, deliberate tone that cut through Prescott's carefully constructed facade. My work is everywhere now. It's being shown in the world's finest galleries. It's being sold for millions. The words echoed in Prescott's mind, reverberating against the marble floors of the gallery. He stood there, stunned, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. The exchange had left him disoriented, rattled in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He had been certain, so absolutely certain, that Marlon's work was just another fleeting artist's attempt to break into the scene. His gallery, after all, was known for curating only the finest, the most refined, and Marlon's art had lacked that polish. The rawness had been too much, too unkempt. And yet, here was a man, calm, composed, and completely at ease, who had just shown him the very truth that had eluded him for so long. Marlon's words rang in his ears, and a knot formed in Prescott's stomach. It wasn't just the sting of being called out, not just the realization that he had been wrong, it was the weight of the embarrassment that now sat squarely on his shoulders. He had dismissed not just a piece of art but an artist who, it seemed, had been far more than he ever anticipated. The moment dragged on, the minutes stretching out like an eternity. Prescott's mind raced. Millions. His gallery had been the first place to turn away an artist whose work was now being sold at Sotheby's for astronomical prices. His ego, his pride, everything he had built his career on, seemed to crumble at the thought. How could he have been so blind? He had to know more. He had to understand the magnitude of what had just happened, the significance of the artist he had so carelessly dismissed. Without another thought, Prescott marched to his office at the back of the gallery, his steps sharp and hurried, the quiet buzz of the gallery now strangely oppressive. The staff members exchanged puzzled glances as he passed, but Prescott was too consumed by the revelation to notice. He threw open the door to his office and immediately reached for his phone, dialing his assistant. Sophie, pull up every recent sale of contemporary art from the last year. I need all the information you can get on an artist named Marlon, the one from that show in Paris. Find out what his pieces are going for. His voice was strained, almost frantic, but Sophie didn't question it. Within minutes, his phone buzzed with the results. The first thing that hit him was a high-profile auction listing from Sotheby's in London, where a painting of Marlon's had sold for an eye-watering $4.2 million. His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the results, another sale in New York, another in Paris. The names of top-tier collectors and museums, for heaven's sake, were attached to these transactions. It was all there in black and white. Marlon was no longer just an artist, he was a global phenomenon. Prescott sank into his leather chair, staring blankly at the screen. The shock of it was overwhelming, like a cold wave crashing over him. Marlon wasn't just successful, he was a star, and Prescott had turned him away. He had looked at the artist and his work through the narrow lens of his own prejudices and assumptions. In doing so, he had missed something monumental. Marlon's art was not simply worth millions, it was shaping the cultural conversation, influencing the very trajectory of contemporary art. As he sat there, processing the reality of what had just occurred, a knot of embarrassment twisted in his stomach. It was one thing to be wrong. Everyone made mistakes. But it was another thing entirely to be confronted with the magnitude of that mistake, to be made painfully aware that his arrogance and short-sightedness had led to the alienation of someone who was now a cornerstone of the art world. Suddenly, the door to his office creaked open, and Sophie stepped inside. Her face was filled with concern as she looked at her boss, whose expression had gone from shock to disbelief. I gathered the information you requested, Sophie began, her voice a little hesitant. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should see this. She held up a printed sheet of paper, the words on it almost too much to process all at once. There, in black ink, was an article from Art Review magazine, one of the most respected art publications in the world. The headline read, Marlon, the artist who changed the landscape of contemporary art. Prescott's gaze locked onto the article as Sophie continued. Marlon's latest collection is being exhibited at the Tate, and is set to go on display in the Louvre next month. His paintings have captivated audiences across Europe and America, with collectors scrambling to own a piece of his work. Marlon is poised to become one of the most important artists of the 21st century. Sophie's voice faded as Prescott's mind reeled. Marlon had already left an indelible mark on the art world, and Prescott hadn't even known it. The truth was undeniable now. His rejection had not been a casual oversight. It had been a critical error, a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his career. How could he have been so blind, so eager to dismiss a talent that was destined to reshape the industry? The door to the office closed softly behind him, and Prescott was left alone with his thoughts. The weight of his arrogance and misunderstanding pressed heavily on his chest. There was no escaping it. He had judged too quickly, and in doing so, he had made an enemy of an artist who was now, by every measure, far beyond his reach. But the most crushing part was the realization that he would never have the chance to amend his mistake. The gallery's name had already been tarnished. Word would spread, and it wouldn't take long for the art world to catch wind of what had happened. Prescott had no doubt that Marlon would never walk through the doors of his gallery again. Not after the way he had been treated. Suddenly, the sound of the door opening broke his thoughts. It was one of the gallery staff, a young woman named Carla, holding a piece of paper in her hands. "Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice quiet but filled with a kind of quiet authority, "I just received an offer for a private showing of some of Marlon's work. It's from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They want a piece for their permanent collection." Prescott's heart sank. The words Metropolitan Museum of Art hung in the air like a death knell. Marlon had already moved on. He had already outgrown the confines of this small gallery. And here was Prescott, too late, too arrogant, and too proud to admit the depth of his failure. Carla paused, her eyes studying Prescott's face. She didn't say anything more, but the silence in the room felt deafening. "I've made a terrible mistake, Carla," Prescott muttered, almost to himself. "I rejected something far more important than just a collection of paintings. I rejected an artist. And now, I'm paying the price." Carla nodded gently, though she remained silent. There was nothing more to say. Prescott had dug his own grave. The minutes stretched on, and as Prescott sat there in his office, the weight of his embarrassment settled in. His mind kept replaying the moment Marlon had walked in, calm, assured, and unyielding, and the reality of the situation became clearer with every passing second. The artist he had mocked, the artist he had humiliated, was now a towering figure in the art world. And he, Vincent Prescott, was the man who had let him slip through his fingers. Marlon's words echoed in his mind once again, "I hope you remember me. And I hope you remember that true art can't be judged by your narrow standards." Prescott leaned back in his chair, staring out the window, realizing that Marlon had already won. It had been almost 2 years since that fateful day when Marlon had walked into the heart of modern art and confronted Vincent Prescott. Since then, his life had undergone a transformation so profound it seemed almost unreal. The raw, untamed artist, the one who had once been dismissed as unworthy, was now a recognized figure, his name spoken with respect and reverence in the art world. His works, once ridiculed for their boldness, were now displayed in museums, auction houses, and the homes of the world's most prestigious collectors. But Marlon wasn't just an artist anymore. He had evolved into something more, a force in the art industry. His influence wasn't just about the paintings he created, but about the curation of the very art he had once dreamed of displaying in galleries like Prescott's. Marlon had spent the last year diving deeper into the business of art, becoming an art consultant, a buyer for major collections, and a curator for some of the world's leading galleries. The lessons he had learned from being on the other side of the table had given him a unique perspective. He was no longer just an artist looking to be seen, he was a gatekeeper, someone with the power to shape the art world from the inside. And now, he was about to do something that would complete his journey. Marlon had made a decision that would forever change the course of his career. He was going to buy the heart of modern art. The idea had come to him slowly, almost as a whisper at first. The gallery that had once rejected him, the place where his dreams had been dismissed, was now the perfect symbol of everything he had overcome. It was more than just a business transaction, it was a statement. He had worked hard to build his reputation, to carve out a space for himself in a world that had once overlooked him. Now, it was time to take that space, to take control of the very institution that had turned him away. It wasn't just about power or revenge, it was about creating a platform for artists who, like him, had been told they weren't enough. It was about redefining the idea of what was worthy of being displayed in a gallery, what kind of art could be recognized and celebrated. He would use this gallery as a beacon of hope for the artists who had been overlooked, the ones who had been told their work was too raw, too unconventional, too different to be appreciated. The deal was struck quickly, a smooth negotiation between Marlon and the owners of the gallery who, after seeing the direction in which the art world was shifting, were eager to sell. As Marlon signed the final papers, a sense of quiet satisfaction washed over him. The gallery that had once rejected him was now in his hands, a place where his vision would finally take shape. But as the ink dried on the contract, Marlon couldn't help but think back to the day he had walked into the heart of modern art with his portfolio in hand, only to be mocked by the gallery owner. He remembered the way Vincent Prescott had looked at him, the dismissive tone of his voice, the arrogance that had dripped from every word he had spoken. Prescott had believed he was the gatekeeper to the art world, the one who could decide who was worthy of recognition. But now, Prescott was nothing more than a relic of the past, someone who had clung to outdated notions of what art should be, and whose inability to adapt had led him to irrelevance. Marlon had not only risen above the rejection, he had surpassed it. He had become something more than what Prescott had imagined. He wasn't just a successful artist, he was now a buyer for some of the most coveted galleries in the world, shaping the future of contemporary art. And as he took control of the heart of modern art, he knew that he was creating something bigger than himself. This was about legacy. It was about giving back to the next generation of artists who, like him, might never have a chance if they weren't given the right platform. A few days later, Marlon stood in the gallery, now his own, taking in the familiar, yet strangely different space. The walls were lined with some of the most sought-after works of art, including his own pieces. The minimalist furniture, the sleek lighting, all of it had been rearranged to reflect his own vision for what a gallery could be. The space was alive with potential, and Marlon could already envision the future, one where new artists, voices that had long been overlooked, could walk through the doors and feel the validation they deserved. It was opening night at the gallery under its new ownership. The air was thick with anticipation, the floor humming with the quiet murmur of the crowd. The elite of the art world had gathered for the grand reveal, the latest collection of contemporary art, much of it sourced by Marlon himself. He had personally curated the exhibit, ensuring that it was a reflection of everything he stood for: authenticity, raw emotion, and unfiltered talent. As the guests mingled, admiring the works on display, the energy in the room was palpable. The gallery was no longer just a place for high society to parade their wealth, it was a space where art could breathe, where talent could rise to the surface regardless of the artist's background or appearance. Marlon walked through the crowd, his presence commanding yet unassuming. He exchanged smiles and handshakes, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't focused on the guests or the success of the evening. His thoughts were with the artists, those whose work had been dismissed by galleries like Prescott's, those whose raw, unpolished expressions had been overlooked by the very institutions that now clamored to buy his pieces. And then, as he was standing near one of his own works, he saw him. Vincent Prescott walked into the gallery, as if by chance, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced air of someone used to the world of high-end art. He was wearing his signature tailored suit, his hair impeccably styled, but something in the way he carried himself seemed different now. He was no longer the confident, self-assured man who had once turned Marlon away. Now, there was a faint tremor in his step, an uncertainty in the way he looked at the paintings on the walls. As he walked further into the room, his eyes locked on Marlon. There was a moment of recognition, and for a brief second, Prescott's face faltered. But Marlon didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He stood there, his posture relaxed, as Prescott approached him. Mr. Prescott, Marlon said, his voice calm but filled with the weight of years of history between them. It's good to see you again. Prescott's eyes darted nervously around the room, taking in the paintings, the guests, the air of success that hung in the gallery. He finally settled his gaze on Marlon, a flicker of embarrassment passing through his eyes. I didn't know you were involved with this gallery, Prescott said, his voice almost apologetic, though it was tempered with the arrogance that had once been his trademark. Marlon smiled, a small, knowing smile. Well, I wasn't involved until recently. But I have to say, I'm quite pleased with the changes I've made. Prescott's eyes widened slightly as he looked around the room. The pieces that hung on the walls were no longer just works of art, they were symbols of Marlon's triumph, the culmination of everything he had worked for. They were masterpieces, in every sense of the word, and they were on display in a gallery that now belonged to Marlon. I see you've made quite the name for yourself, Prescott said, his words hesitant, as though he were trying to keep his composure. Your work is certainly in demand. But I have to admit, I didn't expect this. I didn't know you would. Marlon held up a hand, cutting him off gently. I understand, Mr. Prescott. I know I didn't fit into your vision of what art should be. But sometimes, the things that are hardest to see are the things that turn out to be the most valuable. Prescott's face flushed, and for the first time, Marlon saw a hint of genuine humility. Prescott opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor as he acknowledged the truth in Marlon's words. Enjoy the evening, Marlon said, his voice soft but firm, before turning away. As he walked through the gallery, now his own, Marlon felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge or proving a point, it was about something far more profound. It was about taking control of the space where dreams were made, where artists could finally be seen for what they were, and where true art could find a home. As the evening wore on, Marlon stood by his curated exhibits, watching the guests admire the works of art, both his and others. The gallery had transformed from a place of rejection into a space of acceptance, a space where the raw, the unpolished, the real, and the true could shine. And as he looked around, surrounded by the artists whose work was now displayed proudly on the walls, he knew that he had won, not just for himself, but for every artist who had ever been dismissed, who had ever been told they weren't good enough. This gallery, once a place where he had been humiliated, was now a testament to his victory. And in the end, it wasn't just about what he had accomplished, it was about giving others the chance to accomplish the same.